Before we get to Mike German from the ACLU, as I said at the top of the show, we discuss the issues that profoundly affect your freedom. And now we transition to your civil liberties. We recently brought you the story of Oklahoma paramedic Maurice White, Jr. Mr. White was confronted and choked by an angry and angered Oklahoma police officer who stopped White's ambulance, apparently for failing to yield to him. This as Mr. White was driving a patient to a local hospital. Remember, this was all caught on tape. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, the camera is the new gun. Whenever you deal with the government, you have the right to film what the government is doing and what the government is saying to you. We'll have an update on this story as well as other civil rights abuses. And the civil rights abuses are rampant in this country. I read a story this morning in the Washington Post about a person who was driving to work in Washington, D.C., and someone coming toward him flashed his headlights. The driver, in my story, flashes back. 5 minutes later, he's arrested by the police and in handcuffs for obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice, all he did was flash his headlights. The police claimed that by flashing his headlights, he was acknowledging the flash of the headlights from the driver coming toward him. It was telling him about a checkpoint, a police checkpoint for speeding and for drunk drivers, and that was obstruction of justice. Unfortunately for the police, the person they arrested was a lawyer in the Justice Department who happens to be in one of the whistleblower teams. And the local cops in this town in Maryland now have one heck of a lawsuit on their hands. Let's bring in former FBI agent and current policy counsel to the ACLU, Mike German. Mike, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thanks for having me again, Judge Napolitano.
Nice to have you. The story that we have been talking about in the past couple of weeks involving this paramedic in Oklahoma, stopped by the cops for failure to stop, placed in a chokehold at the side of the road while the patient withered and writhed inside of the EMS vehicle. Is there any update on this? Is there anything new on this? Are we going to see more and more of this, or is it just an isolated incident of one cop going overboard in one instance?
Well, I think that the vast majority of police officers do their job in an appropriate manner, but certainly there are, unfortunately, far too many examples where police go far beyond their authority, and it has seemed to be increasing. And you see it a lot on these televised cop shows where, rather than arresting someone in the way that I was trained as an FBI agent in as low a confrontational posture as possible, it seems like the police take an opportunity to tackle a person and to, throw their knee on the back of somebody's neck. And that sort of activity actually creates, somebody just simply trying to defend themselves, makes it appear as if they're resisting the arrest and escalates the violence. And what I was always taught as a law enforcement officer, that your goal is to de-escalate the violence as much as possible. So this is a troubling trend, and the example in Oklahoma is just one that was caught on tape. And, I think a lot of people have experience with somebody who is abusing their authority and pushing people around, and fortunately this one was caught on tape, so we can discuss the issue at large.
I get a lot of emails, as you can imagine, Mike, every day from people who tell me horror stories about police abuse, and I'm not going to repeat them on air. Some of these I'm able to respond to in a sympathetic way, some in a way because I understand the Constitution. Most I can't, because I can't give, as you know, legal advice over the internet or over the airways to people who are not actually clients that I'm representing. But there is this story that I told as you were coming on this morning, which really startled me. And I just saw it in this morning's Washington Post, and you're in Washington, and you may even know about it. The police arresting someone for acknowledging someone else for flipping their headlights, sort of the universal signal that the police are up above, watch out. Now, when I see that as a driver, and I think when most rational people see that, their initial response is to slow down, drive carefully, obey the law, because they don't want to be arrested and they don't want to break the law. Isn't that really what the police want, that we should slow down and obey the law, rather than that we should speed dangerously, recklessly, right into their trap?
Exactly, and especially if, as it's suggested here, this was some sort of a checkpoint, you wouldn't want somebody going at a high rate of speed into a checkpoint from a simple officer safety issue. So I think you're exactly right that you know, that type of activity is not something that police should be focused on. There's plenty of bad people out there doing bad things. You know, the crime has not gone away, and the police should focus their resources on people who are doing bad things and actually creating a harm to society, not trying to prevent one.
We're on with us, which was too long ago for me, and I hope you can be on more frequently, Mike. We talked about fusion centers. Is there any news on these places where the government is gathering information or maybe even gathering people against their will in ways that could not be justified under the Constitution?
There actually is a bit of good news on that. About a year ago, they came out with this idea of suspicious activity reporting, where they described innocuous activities like photography as an example of preparation for terrorism that should be reported by collected. You know, that information should be collected by the local police and reported to the intelligence community. And we worked with the Director of National Intelligence Information Sharing Environment Program Manager, and they've actually modified their guidelines on that to indicate that things like photography and expressing views are First Amendment protected activities that should not be collected absent some criminal activity.
What are and where are these fusion centers?
Fusion centers are intelligence collection, analysis, and dissemination centers that are popping up all over the country. We put out a report on it at the ACLU in November of 2007. There were 42 centers. In July of 2008, we put out an update. There were 58 centers. There are now over 70 centers. So these centers are popping up all over the country, you know, collecting a lot of information about Americans, and we don't really have a lot of information about what information they're collecting, what they're doing with it, and who they're giving it to. So it's something we're trying to raise public awareness of.
Mike, is this local and state government? Is this the federal government, or is it some aggregation of all three?
It's local, state, federal government, private sector, the military. It involves basically a conglomeration of every type of entity that might have information, which is what makes it so dangerous.
The federal government is also apparently continuing to monitor the keystrokes and the telephone calls of everybody that it wants to, or everybody it sweeps up, even to the point where on the front page of today's New York Times, members of Congress, who happen to be liberal Democrats, but members of Congress are complaining about this. Is NSA spying in the name of security totally out of control, way beyond what the Bush administration promised it would be at the time it got to Congress, either to look the other way or to tacitly endorse this?
Well, part of the problem is we don't know what they have been doing over the last 8 years. We know that certain activities were retroactively legalized last summer with the FISA Amendments Act. But according to the two recent articles out of the New York Times, even with those loosened guidelines, the NSA is still collecting more information than they're legally authorized to using these techniques. So it's something that we're hoping there is a lot of sunshine put onto so we can understand what's happening and actually have a dialogue about whether the NSA is acting to protect our security or is actually becoming a threat to the civil rights and privacy of Americans.
I don't want you to talk about specific litigation, but are these issues before federal judges? Are there ways that we can expect that we will learn the nature and extent of the violations of the Fourth Amendment that the federal government, whatever its intention may be, engages in every day?
There are some lawsuits. Unfortunately, the government and, you know, both under the previous administration and under the new administration are using the state secrets privilege that is a common law privilege to protect certain pieces of evidence to actually shut down entire cases. And, of course, with the new law passed last summer, there was immunity provisions for companies that participated in the illegal programs. So those cases have also been shut down. So the courthouse door is being shut on many of these cases that would have provided that extra check against executive abuse.
Mike German, formerly from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and now from the American Civil Liberties Union, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
From Judge Napolitano at Freedom Watch, stay free.